still I rise. Some say it's a mystery how I still believe that in spite of all I've been through, I could still push the wheel. See, I have a power they can't see with their eyes. It's a little thing called faith that makes broken wings fly. I rise, though I'm hurting but not broken, down but I won't die. I rise, soon I will reach the sky and still I rise. Who can understand when just an ordinary man defies the odds and still fights on to win? I can take it, I can make it. I rise, see, I'm hurting but not broken, down but I won't die. I rise, soon I will reach the sky and still I rise, see, I'm hurting but not broken, down but I won't die. I rise, soon I will reach the sky and still I rise.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending day 2 of the BLAC Policy Summit. I hope you found yesterday to be incredible as I did, and you just see new ways to just use your voice and to tell your story. Today, I'm excited to start with the panel discussion with a few of my favorite ladies in the world, Shana Goggins, Akisha Townsend, and Melanie Meade. And I believe this discussion is critical to various areas of our work, such as identity politics, to break down essentialism, gender, racism, economic, and environmental justice. While we may not realize this conversation is critical to place-based work, in that the Appalachian identity can be discussed through region, race, and language to confront the historical and present-day invisibility of Black people in Appalachia, their contributions, their legacy, and their voices. Again, as I said, joining me today in this discussion is Shana Goggins, who's a community organizer, attorney Akisha Townsend Eaton, and community organizer and naturopath Melanie Meade. Before we get started, I'd like to do a little bit of housekeeping. Again, as I said yesterday, I understand that people suffer from Zoom fatigue, even though it's early in the morning. Please feel free to keep your cameras off. If you so choose to show your wonderful face, we welcome it. Do what you have to do, meet your needs. If you have to step away for water, please do so. We are just asking that you just be vocal in the space. Expression is welcome. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. There will be individuals who are monitoring the chat. If you have a story to tell, as we said yesterday, we love to hear your stories, be it a story of a Black person in Appalachia, a white person in Appalachia, or a person of color. Diverse stories are needed to confront the issues that we are faced with every day. I also want to just remind you that we don't gloss over you, we witness you. So if you find that there are moments that we pause, please join us in the pause and holding and supporting that person who's experiencing a moment in their life. When we tell our stories, they trigger us. There's something inside stories that resonates with people, and sometimes that resonance is with trauma. And we learned yesterday that we do hold trauma inside of our stories. And when we see that and identify it, we want to honor it, support it, and hold that person in it and not gloss over them. I hope that you find this panel discussion just as rich as I do. After our panel discussion, we'll take a 5-minute break, as you can see from the agenda. And then what we'll do is we'll go into our breakout rooms. The agenda, which will be placed in the link, will have a list of the different breakout sessions that you can attend. What we're going to do is for the breakout session that you attend in the morning, you'll attend the same one in the afternoon. And that's strategically done because a lot of times what we get is we get the information, but we never get the tools to put it in practice. So in the morning, you'll get the information, you'll break for lunch. And then when you come back, you'll go back to that same room. And then you'll get the skills and the tools that you need to put this into practice in your community, in your work. There is one change to the agenda. In the afternoon, Artie Griffin and Nora's room will be joined together. And so the participants who go into those rooms will come together in the afternoon into one room, and we will announce that upon coming back. So again, welcome to day 2 of the Policy Summit. I want to welcome Shana Goggins, Akisha Townsend, and Melanie Meade. And I want to thank you for being a part of this conversation. And I want you to know that I am also honored to have you as a part of this conversation. Ladies, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Well, you know me, I am a bundle of nerves mixed in with anxiety, but we will get through this. So to start us off, Shana, I'd like to start with you. One of the things that I saw in your bio is how boldly and proudly you spoke about being a Black Appalachian. However, we know that many people either do not acknowledge their regional identity due to racial hurt and harm, or not knowing that they actually live in the Appalachian region. How does the way stories are told about Appalachia create an identity disconnect? And was there ever a time where you found yourself struggling with this identity disconnect?
Yes, I will say yes to your last question, in that with age comes wisdom, right? So there's so many things that I know at 46 that I did not know at 16, and I'm a better person as a result of it. And I think one of those facts, if you will, that I know is that the region of the Commonwealth of Kentucky that I was born and raised in is actually part of the Appalachian region. So all along, I knew that I was from a uniquely different and special place, but it was a majority white space. So when you think of Appalachia, you think of what is mainly presented, and the most common face of Appalachia is a white face. So it took me a long time to accept that, just geographically, that I was Appalachian. And then when I started thinking about traits and characteristics and just things that I knew, experiences that I enjoyed, values that I had, I was able to put those with the Appalachian culture as a whole. So that really shifted the way that I move about life, in that I'd always really had this notion that wherever I wanted to be was where I was allowed to be. And I think when we talk about culture and we talk about regional identities, that's also important, because many times people that look like me, we find that there are places that we're not supposed to be in. But when you embrace that you actually, this is your place, this is your space, and you can take ownership of that, it's very empowering. And this, as far as the first portion of your question, I was fortunate that when I was coming up, my grandfather, my father's father, of my 4 grandparents, he was the one that retired first. So he spent a lot of his days being our chauffeur and watching us, if you will. But even on top of that, every night he would come to our house. We lived on the same street. So he would walk down to our house and he would tell us bedtime stories. And he would read like the traditionals, like Jack and the Beanstalk and Goldilocks and the Three Bears. But he also told us stories of his life growing up in Pulaski County, Kentucky. And many of the stories that he shared, they dealt with segregation and they dealt with discrimination. But we were kids. We didn't really know that that's what he was talking to us about. And then again, as I said, as I got older and have been able to reflect upon those stories and listen to them again, he recorded a couple for us. on a cassette tape that we cherish. But when I have been able to go back and listen to those stories and think about those stories, and then think about the stories for my grandmother, his wife, and then my mom's parents, it was, the story was already there in that we were Black people in a rural space, but in a unique rural space in that we were part of the Appalachian culture, and we didn't know that. And there were many examples of how people or situations kind of tried to reinforce or reiterate that this was not ours and that we needed to have something that was uniquely separate of this. So I've been fortunate that my professional and personal experiences, they bring all of those things back, to the forefront. If I'd known all of this information when I was a kid, I don't know as though I would have appreciated it as much. But the bittersweet part of it is that I don't have the position, I'm not in the position that I can talk with all of my grandparents about that under the lens of what being a Black Appalachian is. My grandmother, my mother's mother, she's still with us, but she does not consider herself to be a Black Appalachian. And it's in part to what you mentioned, Bishop Marcia, in that in her mind, Appalachians are uneducated, bigoted people, and that is not what she is. So it might take a little bit more to get her to come along to embrace the label, but it's based on her experiences. And Appalachians have been, primarily white individuals that were racist, or Appalachia itself as an institution upheld segregation. So she doesn't quite feel the same way about it that I do. And we talk about it. And I think that it's important we have this intergenerational conversation, because these things that were not so easy for me to embrace, my daughter, she readily embraces them. So as we go along and we share those stories, and we kind of highlight that we are a part of this group, the fact that we don't see ourselves in the story of Appalachia, that becomes less and less.
Thank you for that, Shana. And you pointed out some really powerful things. Number one is the intergenerational acceptance of the identity, and the fact of, like you said, your grandmother, how she sees it because of the racial hurt and harm, and people being viewed as uneducated and negative, which sits inside of this monolithic whitewash narrative about Appalachian and whiteness. But then how, as things began to evolve, you slowly but surely began to embrace it. And now your daughter is like, hey, I'm proud, And so we have to look at, I think that's a powerful point, because we do have to look at how things evolve, and also, looking at going back, offers us an opportunity to dismantle and interrupt some of the narratives, but have a clear understanding as to the why. Because we often, accuse people of just acquiescing and not doing anything, but really what's sitting that person down is the story that they identify with inside of their lived experience. And this is why it's important that we walk with people very gingerly, with this. And when you talked about this invisibility, it made me think about Akisha's story, that she shared in our prior listening sessions. And so, Akisha, I want to go over to you, because you mentioned your great-great-grandmother who was a midwife. But when you search for the historical account of her life, there was nothing to be found. Can you speak to how this erasure impacts Appalachian history and identity? In essence, as Shana said, if I don't see myself in the story, how do I connect to the story to even share my story? How do we build upon this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can resonate with Shana's story as well. I didn't really consider myself even as Appalachian until probably sometime in my 20s, when I had left this region and was living in the DC area, and found other Black Appalachians who were claiming their identity. And I thought to myself, well, I'm actually from that region too, but I have never put those two words together, Black Appalachian. I never really considered myself as um, you know, being Appalachian, and even though the county that I live in is technically not a part of Appalachia, a lot of my family, like my great great grandmother and grandmother and many family members come from those Appalachian states and counties, Tennessee. So Mammy Callie, my great grandmother, was the one who was a midwife who delivered black and white babies. She rode by horse, so she rode on horseback into the remote areas of the mountains to deliver babies that did not have access to those resources and could not leave the area, and that is something that was told to me by my grandmother, by my mom. And the tradition of storytelling is so rich. The oral story telling tradition, you almost could transport yourself into that time and see yourself riding along with her on horseback on these adventures delivering babies. And so, that in itself, in 2022, in this time period, just the idea of that even happening with anybody, horseback deliveries is something to marvel at, I think. But when you look at the documentaries, not just on midwifery, but on anything having to do with Appalachia, as Shana referenced, you don't see us represented. You see white midwives, and those stories have been totally erased. Same with other traditions like music, for example. When you hear Appalachian music, it's almost always someone who is, a white Appalachian on a porch picking a banjo, without really referencing the African influences of that itself, but also, the African American Appalachian music, gospel music. How did those, what did that look like, in terms of language? Even it's funny. I was almost born speaking mountain talk without realizing where my language came from. And it's really interesting. You talk about intergenerational acceptance, because my parents didn't talk like that. My grandmother did. And so, I adopted, and so did some of the children at school, who came from other areas of Appalachia and kind of migrated to this area. Those influences came with them. And, I was using the, the terminology and had the dialect, and my parents were like, where did that come from? we don't really speak like that. But I was like, yeah, but my grandmother does. So she would say, over yonder, and you're just a hollering and a jumping and a and a screaming. And that was just something that I never really identified as being Appalachian. But now I know where those roots come from. And having a group like BLAC, I mean, it's great, because I, am listening to some of the stories that are similar to mine, and also coming up with new questions to ask and new routes to explore, to kind of piece together the pieces of my own identity. So I'm really, really grateful for that. And yeah, I in terms of being able to tell your story, it's so important. I was listening to someone in my generation the other day who was also a Black Appalachian, and she said a common experience that we have is that we both feel out of place, and we also have a history of displacement. So when you mix those two things together, it is really hard to piece together a story like someone else might be able to do. So my own family, our businesses and homes were taken through urban renewal, and now a university sits there. So that story is also part of mine and many other Black Appalachians as well. But it is really important to be able to the extent possible. And I'm really blessed that, my mom is still here, and she's now about to be 80, and but she still has that memory of those vivid stories, and she's able to pass that down to me. And I know I won't be able to do it nearly as good of a job as she has in passing it on to the next generations, but I sure will try.
Thank you, Akisha, for sharing that. And bringing home, I think, something that we really don't often consider. And you talked about the dialect. And as part of this work, in maintaining the stories and the narrative, or when we talk about place-based identity, what comes with that? That's the language, that's the land, so many things that people identify with, but yet it's weaponized, against them. And you're told that you have to kind of conform and speak to, the ways, or be socially conditioned to be acceptable. And so you lose the essence of who you are, and part of your identity and those things that make you uniquely you. And so I think as we kind of look at our narrative work, we also have to think about this thing around language justice. You also mentioned about, which I think is another thing that we don't often look at, is story-based work has to go much deeper than just pen to paper. We have to have the oral tradition, maintain that oral tradition, because one of the things that also has harmed Black people and even people of color in Appalachia is the imagery. The imagery that also creates this displacement or the vision. And so when you can sit and begin to see yourself, like you said, in so many different ways inside of the story, then the story becomes more real. And then you get excited. The tool that has been used against us, be it, for Black people, period, and people of color, has always been this tool of not being portrayed accurately in pictures and images and even through media, through even the oral tradition. So thank you for just bringing that back home and allowing us to grab hold of that. And this takes me to Melanie, who lives in Clairton, PA. And Melanie, you speak about Clairton suffering today, that, it is such a small city with big problems. However, these issues are not talked about nor brought to the forefront. And so how has this level of invisibility impacted you, your community, and people identifying with their Appalachian identity?
Thank you for asking me, Archbishop. And I could identify and relate with both Akisha and Shana, because first off, my paternal grandmother was originally from this land. She was Shawnee, and there are the Delaware, Susquehannock, Shawnee, and Iroquois Indian tribes here. So those people had land here, and this industry took it over from them. And I didn't know that as a child. I wasn't told, but through my father's work, he told us and gave us place value. He taught us that we were Appalachian. When we would travel to family reunions through Tennessee, we would stop on different points that were historical for our tradition of going and getting back in safe ways to visit families and not have to deal with the fact that we weren't accepted and almost rejected when we were seen in those back dark areas. The community suffers from egregious illegal emissions from the Clairton Coke Works for years. Many times people will come to me and say, why are you saying something? They don't care. And that would give me more motivation, not because of the strength or power within myself, but because of the strength and power I found within the BLAC coalition. Finding a group of people who realize we have to say something in order for anything to be done. And that's one of the reasons why I believe Clairton doesn't get the attention that it needs, nor does it get the help that it needs. We are known for being a great football city. We do have some professional NFLers, but we don't have them being empowered to use their influence to create change. It would put a spotlight on our community, but they are taught and conditioned, if we could say, systematically conditioned to say, don't look at this, that's not your business. But they are receiving the poor health benefit of it, but they're told it's not their right to say anything. In 2022, we have a group of people who feel they can't speak against the illegal actions of an industry. Most of the fine money that they receive is about, it compares to 3 people having a meal at Applebee's. So for the industry, there isn't really any reason to change. They can pay to pollute, and our community suffers. I mentioned yesterday, little Black boys in Clairton have 5 times the national average in asthma. And that is only in our school, which is a small school. We have 2 other schools. And those same little Black boys are celebrated as they're playing on the football field and forgotten about afterwards. There isn't anything in the community that provides them with a way out of I shouldn't say a way out, because they're all told to get out. When our graduates in high school graduate, they're told to leave and get out of here as fast as they can. How can the community build and develop? And that was a clear answer for me that I needed to stand up. And that's why I'm so thankful to have you all here, because you empower me, motivate me, and give me the right information so that I can take it back to the community and say, this is incorrect. Look at it from this perspective. And when my father and mother passed away in the same year, I remember that was their legacy and tradition. People in the community would come to them because they would want the truth of the answer, not what was beneficial for one side or the other. And that's like what storytelling does. It brings us together so that we realize where our stories interconnect. And also we look to others whenever we see our experiences and how they've overcome their situations and their stories. And that's what is best for us to go back to, because our children need to take time to commune with family. That is the benefit that has always been our African tradition.
Thank you, Melanie, for pointing out, one of the reasons we do this work is because we need the accurate accounts of our stories, not somebody telling the story of who we are to benefit, the oppression and the suppression, that they promoted or self-imposed upon our bodies. Just wonderful to hear how people came to your family's home because they wanted truth. They wanted accurate accounts. But then this thing about interconnectedness of our experiences, and we tend to relegate that down to a few different things, but I think it's much deeper than that. And Akisha does a very good job of pointing that out. Someone mentioned yesterday about the trauma attached to our stories. And so Akisha, I know in your work, you see a level of trauma in ways that we have never thought about, such as companion and assistance animals. Would you share an example about this and why it's important, especially when Melanie speaks to this interconnectedness, because that's just a small but yet a great example, of interconnectedness in our stories that we tend to, overlook. And, truthfully, we cannot discount any parts of our story because your whole story is a part of your lived experience. And the whole experience, unfortunately, has also been used against us when we do not share these types of unlikely stories. So, Akisha, can you just kind of expound upon that, when we talk about this interdependency in our stories and why it's needed?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm often asked the question, how did you get into the field that you're in? What interested you in this field of human and animal well-being, which is the area that I work in. And when I think about it, there are lots of different answers to that, but really that one of the earliest answers has to do with my first answer to your question. And that is the storytelling, the importance of my family's animals. I knew, I know the name of every dog that's ever lived in our family going back, 100 years, and the stories that come with those animals and how important they were
Hey,
to
good morning.
family. The dog that protected my grandmother and my aunt, from danger while their parents were out farming, and the real relationship that they have. And one of the most poignant stories that I can think of that really inspired me to go into policy in this area was Hurricane Katrina. Not a lot of people know that the reason why so many people didn't evacuate was because they were not given the option to evacuate with their companion and assistance animals. Up to 44% of the people who did not evacuate cited that specific reason, and a lot of those folks perished. A lot of those folks made that difficult choice to stay behind and see if they would survive. And a lot of them didn't. They perished alongside their pets. And so now we have something called the Federal Pets Act, which basically, because of Hurricane Katrina, it requires municipalities, cities to at least consider the needs of people and pets when they're evacuating, as well as the needs that happen after that time. And there's a lot more to do in that area, but a lot of people had to give their lives. And this is something that in the larger animal welfare world, which is predominantly white, these stories aren't told either, as to why, it actually costs lives to get this federal act. We have situations where people are not going to cooling centers because the cooling centers will not accept companion animals. And we all know how hot it is right now, and what that means to folks who are especially vulnerable. You talk about elderly people, and there's a situation where there's a widow, right, that this animal is all this widow has left. It's the reminder of her husband. They shared this animal together, and there's no way that she's going to part to get assistance for any of the critical needs unless she knows that the well-being of the animal is taken care of as well. We saw the same thing during COVID. There was actually an NIH study that was published that talked about people who delayed care or avoided it altogether because they did not have a place for their companion animals and assistance animals to go to. And so when we talk about policy, I think in the Black community, there's always a little bit of questioning about, are you putting the priority of animals before people? And when you think about the importance of animals to people, you really have to look at those needs together. If you really want those critical services and to be accessed, and you really have to acknowledge that relationship. So I'm happy to just share some snippets of the work that I'm doing and some of the stories that lead into policy. But you're absolutely right that our relationships with our companion animals are very much a part of our story, and oftentimes that's not those stories aren't told, but they're very relevant to so many policies, from environmental justice to economic justice, and everything in between.
Thank you. Like you said, I don't think I studied, I had to take a class, and there was a book called the 9 Lives that really spoke to Hurricane Katrina, and never once throughout that whole book did they mention just what you said. So I think, I appreciate, you helping us to broaden, the way that we think about things and the diverse policies that are in place that we really don't engage in because we don't have this information or this knowledge. And so laws like that or policies like that really go largely unsupported by those who really need it. So again, I want to thank you, for sharing that. And so Shana, I want to come back to you, because one of the things that Akisha, that she expounded on, and we want to just kind of drive home, is this work, is narrative work, and why is narrative work in storytelling essential to dismantling the way stories are told about the Black experience and culture in Appalachia?
It's an easy question, but also it's a difficult question, right? Because when you think about identity, in part, our identities are informed by our culture, and culture is basically everything that we know, how we process, how we understand the world. Stories and narrative pieces are critically important in that if you consider that when elected officials are coming together and let's say they're discussing policy or they're trying to devise a strategy, how to tackle a particular issue or topic, if you don't have a piece from all of the characters in the story, if you will, then you're making a very one-sided solution to a possible problem that you're trying to address. So my story is important. Akisha's story is important. Melanie's story is important. There are many similarities across our stories, even though we live in different parts of Appalachia. But there's a lot of uniqueness in the things that we have experienced. So no one can look at us and say, oh, these 3 Black women, they represent Appalachia, and everything that they've experienced should inform how we work to improve Appalachia, because we would be missing some very important critical details. So it's important for your story to be included in the collective, because there are things that we as individuals have experienced that need to be highlighted and focused on. We are all people that live in the Appalachian region, but our experience in Appalachia has been influenced by many different things. And our experiences are the backbone of how we improve the quality of life in this region. The stories that I was telling you about that I heard from my grandparents, education was something that was highlighted. So education and how I have moved in educational and academic settings, that's a part of my story, but that's not for everyone. So if we just looked at what I valued or thought was significant or important about education, we would only be focusing on what I thought was important. So we are all the main character in this story. And so each of us should have the opportunity to have our stories highlighted. And our stories are how we send messages to elected officials. Some of the work that I focused on in the past year is in working with members to help them lobby our state representatives. And in lobbying someone, if Crystal were here, she could give a much better eloquent definition of this. But essentially, when we lobby elected officials, we are telling them our story. We are telling them about how the bill that they are proposing may harm us or may help us. And we have to be comfortable sharing our story because our stories are important. Our stories are the end results of policies and bills and legislation that's being handed down to us. And the way that we can most directly impact that process is by adding those parts and pieces that make up our stories. And I'm not sure, Bishop Marcia, if there was something else that you wanted me to highlight. I just think it's important to tell your story. And let me say that you will be uncomfortable sharing your story. Many stories were shared last night in our welcome that were very personal, of a very personal nature. And it takes a lot of strength to, one, share a story with people that you know, And it takes a certainly different set of strength to share your story with people that you don't know.
That is so true.
We should all be, and I think that it doesn't matter how long it took you to tell your story. It's the fact that you feel comfortable enough to tell your story now. I was with a group of young adults the other day, and what I appreciated the most about that group of individuals that were 18 to 25 is that they are fully prepared to stand in their truth. And part of that is their story. And, you know, we can learn a lot from generations below us how to do that, because I think the world that we live in has forced people, whether they were ready or not, to be able to share their story and to be able to use that for good, hopefully.
Thank you for that, Shana. You had answered the question, so
Okay.
yeah, you were
I
fine.
always worry that I'm just rambling on.
No.
So, rein me in if need be.
No, okay. You know, again, you know, thank you for pointing out, you know, the different ways, and you're right, Crystal Good, who authors Black by God, who is on here, and will, Crystal, I hope if you're listening, you don't mind us bringing you into the conversation and don't feel put on the spot. But I think your voice is definitely, you know, needed in this part of the conversation. So if you're willing, I would like to bring you in this part of the conversation. Number one, simply be, you know, thinking about what you said, and the different ways we can tell our story. And so, you know, we know that storytelling, as you have just said, is key to dispelling myths, dismantling invisibility. You know, that we have to have accurate accounts of our lived experiences, because what has occurred is through this monolithic narrative that has been romanticized, that it has created, you know, dividing lines that have separated Black people and Black Appalachians, the urban experience from the rural experience. And then there's white America, and then there's Black America, you know, and so we need to, you know, to interrupt and dismantle these identity politics that's often used against us racially, economically, as you said, Shana, educationally, and communally, to name a few. And so what I'd like for each one of you to do, if you don't mind, is to ask, you know, number one, what are some of the ways we can tell and use our stories to have these accurate accounts? But more importantly, you know, what are the accurate accounts of our lived experiences, and to break these dividing lines? But as you were saying earlier, how we also use this as an educational tool to speak to elected officials about the harm and the danger of their degenerative policy making. And so, Crystal, if you are open, please come off your mic.
Yeah.
And, you know, speak to, you know, number one, in your work, you founded this newsletter, Black by God, which speaks to a lot of the social ills and the issues in, you know, West Virginia. But number two, how you found it needed and necessary to lobby and to sit in meetings, you know, that Black people ordinarily wouldn't sit in, and how this helped you in the work that you do. So if you can start us off with that conversation, I'd greatly appreciate.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here. I'm going to be off camera. But, you know, first I want to say, you know, I sort of fumbled into lobbying and policy work. And that was because in West Virginia, we had the West Virginia water crisis. 600,000 people were without water due to a policy issue, which was the state was not regulating these water tanks or these storage tanks that were sitting beside the river. So a small hole went into one of these storage tanks, the chemical leaked out into the river, and 600,000 people were without water. And I could not understand how a policy, right, could have changed this if they were only inspecting the tanks. So I started going to the Capitol and started paying attention, and really just moved into a policy work very naively, but also very curious. And that's when I started to look around and notice that there were no Black lobbyists. We did not have a presence at the West Virginia Capitol. Now, we would show up perhaps for a certain day or a certain cause, but that sort of came and went. And so, you know, I'm also an artist and a poet and just really like to kind of just figure things out or just look at things differently. So I applied that. And I'm sharing that because you can't get your story wrong. You can't get your curiosity wrong, right? And the question that you have, I guarantee you, there are 10 or thousands of people that have the same question. So from the West Virginia water crisis, I turned that into a profession. I started lobbying at the Capitol, grassroots, for environmental causes, for women's health issue. And I think it was because I didn't know what I was doing that I was able to do some really amazing things. So I share that because you don't have to have a policy degree. You don't have to have anything other than your heart and your ambition to show up, to learn, and to talk to people. And if you do it, you will educate more people. And I know that my colleague and my friend, Dr. Shaniqua Smith, is on here listening. And what we did last year, and thank you, Bishop Dinkins, for coming to West Virginia. We hosted West Virginia Black Policy Day. And how we entered into that was together. We're going to learn together. And I just want to say, as far as Black policy goes, especially in West Virginia and across Appalachia, when you have lawmakers who are predominantly white men over 50, and depending on how your legislature gathers, ours gathers for 60 days, and they are sort of sequestered in the Capitol. When you have a group of people that don't see other people for 60 days, they forget who their constituents are. So it's very important that you show up, that we show up. And I say that because you will change the room. You may not even say a word, but when you walk into a policy committee room, when you walk the halls, when you are seen and visible, they don't know who you are. They don't know if you work for Joe Biden or who you work for, okay? But they know you're there and they see you because, well, the skin that we come in, we are seen. And this is actually a unique place, right? That this is, our visibility can change the room. And so what we're doing in West Virginia, I'm really proud of it because we're taking one step, and that is to show up, and that is to show up collectively, and not just show up on Black History Day, right? But to show up on all the days. I know Dr. Smith tomorrow will be heading to the West Virginia Capitol for interims. And if you're not familiar with interims in your state, look that up. That's a great place to meet lawmakers, but just want to really encourage everyone on here that you have everything you need to enter into this work. You have your curiosity, you have your knowledge, you have your passion for your communities, and you have your story. And one of the things, you know, that Shana was sharing, encouraging everybody, is to share your story, because let me tell you, you can't get it wrong. It's yours. It's your story. There are some tools and some things that can, you know, comfort you or give you some confidence. But at the end of the day, any lawmaker that you speak to, you're doing the work. And I cannot speak to how important this is for Appalachia as a whole, that we show up in a collective Black policy. And I'm so glad that this convening is happening. And one of the goals that I would like to just throw out there through Black by God, through anybody listening, is that, you know, we really take a look at the disproportionate expulsion rates for Black students across Central Appalachia and Appalachia, because I feel as if there's so many different policy things that we need to rally around. And that's why this work becomes so overwhelming. But I do feel as if that this convening we could exit it with a few policy bullets that we all agree on, that we need to center on, because let me tell you, a collective Black Appalachian policy voice is probably one of the most powerful things that I can imagine, not just for Appalachia, but for this country. So thank you for giving me space to share. I'll put my info in the chat, and I'm happy to answer questions or amplify any information that you all have in your communities. Black by God's here to help. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. You know, I'm going to, just for the sake of time, because I'd like to leave, you know, time for question and answers, if folks have any, is to first of all say thank you. I think you rounded that up quite nicely. You know, just showing up breaks the level of invisibility. Showing up changes the story and reframes the narrative. And I like how Crystal said, you can't get your story wrong. It's your story. You can't get your curiosity wrong, because it's your curiosity. You know, the biggest thing inside of her story is it's yours. You know, and the skin you show up in, you know, that changes right then and there. And then this thing around, yes, the whole goal of BLAC is to have a set of policies that we come together on. You know, the whole goal of BLAC is to really bring about, you know, this thing around narrative shifting and reframing. And, you know, I love how Crystal mentioned about being an artist and a poet, and how she took who she is and she put it into her work. You know, you don't have to know what you're doing and how to do it. Remember this, you only have to have a desire for change. And that's the fire that she and so many others are able to fan the flame in. And as a result of that, you have Black by God. You have Dr. Shaniqua Smith, who's doing some things around civic engagement. You have Melanie Meade, you know, who's using her voice around natural, you know, homeopathic medicine, as well as youth and storytelling to build up the Black voice in PA. And then you have Shana, you know, a community organizer, but is speaking very loudly and boldly and unapologetically about what's needed for Black people. And then you have Akisha Townsend, who's a lawyer, you know, but at the same time, you know, understands, you know, that the laws and the policies that come our way, you know, require our voice and our presence there. So what I want you to grab hold to is you need not be absent from class. You need not be absent from a city council meeting. You need not be absent from a community meeting. You need not to be absent in your own story. It's your story. It's yours to tell, and it has power. It does change things. Even if it starts within your community. We think we have to do things on a grand scale, but if you can shift the narrative, you have done something powerful when we are all speaking the same language. We're all in rhythm and going into the same direction. So Crystal, Shana, Melanie, and Akisha, thank you for all that you brought into this conversation. I appreciate you so very much. And for those who don't know, this has been, you know, the arms and the shoulders, you know, that have helped to lift up BLAC, as well as Reverend Ronald English. I don't know if he's here or not. And we have Zabrian Smith and, you know, Pastor Heller and Corinne Williams and, you know, so many others. But the voices and the strength behind BLAC that has supported me very strongly has been Akisha Townsend, Shana Goggins, Melanie Meade, and Crystal Good. And so this goes to show you that we can come together as Black women, Black voices, and stand in our identity and do what needs to be done. We don't have to live an either or life. We get to be both and. And that's not just for us, that's for everybody. There is a both and story inside of Appalachia, Black and white. And we have to remember that. The white culture or the white experience is not absent of the Black experience. And so just as Crystal said, showing up gets you there. So I'd like to open up the floor. If anybody has any questions, you can raise your hand and we'll monitor between, you know, the left and the two different screens. And if you have something you want to say in the chat, you know, by all means, please do so. But I open up the floor to our participants now, to our listeners. We must have did a good job, y'all, because nobody has anything to say.
I mean, you said it. I don't think anybody wants to. Everybody's just basking in the moment.
Well, thank you. Well, you know, again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat. Joseph, I see you come off camera. Did you want to say, share, or ask anything?
I wanted to thank Crystal because she does tremendous work in Charleston, and I know that work can be lonely and difficult, and that I suppose I'm a white man, and one thing I would like to say, and I live in Appalachia, I'm from Ohio, but we also have to get the policy right, poor people are getting crushed in this country right now. And we're not even telling that, there's so few politicians even addressing that. And, frankly, Joe Manchin is an embarrassment to me, for what he's not done for the region and for humanity, frankly. And, because, we live in a planet that's warm. Our problems are pretty dire right now. I mean, they're collectively. And I don't just mean black and white issues. I mean, as a species, we're facing extinction and doing nothing about it except continuing to burn oil and gas. And much of it is produced in this region. I've been fighting fracking for years, and many of you in Pennsylvania know all about that. And it's true. All these issues affect the poorest communities the worst. They bear the brunt. They're the social shock absorbers of environmental devastation. And, I appreciate the fact that you're opening up to white people. There are voices out here who want to support everything you're doing here. So that much I can tell you. There's a lack of a sense of belonging, I suppose. And I think that especially in poor white Appalachia, the opioid crisis, there's so many devastating problems that need to be addressed. Where do you start? There are counties that are predominantly white with roughly, towns with 80% unemployment. There's nowhere to go except for the pharmacy for a job. There's, I just want to bear witness to that too, that I think somehow we all got to work together on this stuff, or we're all going to lose. And we're losing. We can't sit here and say that we're winning right now. We got to fight back. I mean, when you get knocked back, you got to fight back. And that's where I'm coming from. And so, however I can help you all, I want to do that, because I can see that you're going the right way.
Thank you so much for speaking the truth. That's, that's a powerful truth, period, point blank. And what I like that you pointed out, Joseph, is one thing that we don't pay attention to, is that we have been conditioned and we've normalized othering. Even though we're saying the Black Appalachian Coalition, we're only saying that again because we know Black voices have to be heard. But we are not exempting other voices, because, as I said before, it's going to take all of us, not just some of us, but electeds, and the narrative and the stories that are told separate and isolate and divide us. And so I'm so glad, Joseph, that you called for a revision to the history book today. I'm so glad that all of you have, joined us so that we can begin to revise. And as Crystal said, when we leave here, we want to have a set of things that we want to work on together, so that after this policy summit, we're not just stopping. We're getting full steam ahead. We are putting this train together across the Ohio River Valley to let electeds know and to let people know you are not in this alone. I loved how you said the social shock absorbers. There is this lack of a sense of belonging, because that is the divide that we see between Black and, Black America, white America, rural America, and countless other things. And so, yes, we do have our work cut out for us. But again, if we can lock arm in arm, we can step and sync one with another. And then we can model how privilege and whiteness and Blackness, or all of these social constructs that they have put into place, that we rise above those so that we can heal we can transform, we can change, and we can get to the place of total sustainability that we need as a whole person and not just fragments of a person. I'm going to turn it over to you, Apostle Ford, and then I'll do some wrap up of announcements. We'll take a break. I know this has been a long morning, but I just wanted to appreciate you, Joseph, and what you said and make space for you, Apostle Frederick.
Good morning, everyone. Apostle Dr. Frederick Ford from Fort Wayne, Indiana. I just want to say that this summit has been so informative and so powerful in every single presentation. And Joseph, you are certainly right. This is all about humanity. And we seem to have lost that. The black and white issues, that's ridiculous. That is not of God. And so and you're also right about how little our government and all officials think about poor people. And I am one who is a part of the Indiana and the National Poor People's Campaign. And we are fighting for these exact same things. It's for everybody. It's for all humanity. There are poor people in every ethnicity that exist. And we got to stop playing, because you are right, Joseph. We are up for extinction. We're not paying attention to climate, the climate issues. We don't care anything about women's issues, Black issues, white issues, brown people's issues, Asian issues. We're not paying attention. This is about humanity. And I learned some things today about the Appalachian folks. Oh, my goodness. When you come from other parts of the country, you don't know anything about that. And originally, I'm from New York and didn't know about that. So we just thank God for this summit and for all of you who are openly willing to participate. Thank you, and God bless you all. Let it be written, let it be so.
Thank you, Apostle Dr. Frederick Ford. You know, Shana, Melanie, Crystal, and Akisha, I want to thank you for being a part, again, for lending your voices to this panel discussion. Joseph and Dr. Ford, for speaking out, you know, on the things that we need to address. Because what I heard and what I feel is that we were once lulled to sleep. We were once heavily anesthetized, but today is our wake up day. Today is the day that we wake up fully and we wake up present and ready to do what it is we need to do. And that is the purpose of this summit, to no longer be lulled to sleep, and for us to have a call to action, to wake up. So again, I want to thank each and every one of our panelists for sharing their stories. I want to thank you because we have learned, as Dr. Ford said, storytelling is key to dispelling myths, dismantling invisibility, breaking down those political levers and divestments due to the whitewash narrative. We have learned today that our stories must be reclaimed, remembered, told, and elevated for the change we need in our healing as a collective people. More importantly, it was brought home that we are all essential to this work, because if we are to break down the cornerstone myth of white American whiteness, we need the truth of all stories told, not only through the Black voice and lived experience, but through the acknowledgement of support and support of white voices regarding the harm from white dominant cultures and narratives historically and today. I want you all to be encouraged to know we are all essential to this work. And I'm so glad that you're here joining us. What we're going to do for our next steps is we are going to take a break. I believe that break is what, Annie, 5 minutes. You have on the agenda, it listed the different workshops that you can go to. I will go to that agenda And so if you don't have it, someone will put it in the chat, but you will see that the breakout rooms are, there's breakout room 1, which addresses policy advocacy 101, with Akisha, Townsend, Eaton being the presenter. Breakout room 2 is going to address what's your energy democracy story. Breakout room 3 will address the role of research and policy making. And breakout 4 is what is Justice 40 and how can communities be organized at this moment. From what I understand, there will be a way that you can go to your breakout room. But for now, we are going to give you a break and ask that you return back. It's 11:05. Let's say about 11:10. So that you can come and get in your breakout rooms and get situated. So for the next 5-6